I was looking through some complaints today when I saw one that made me chuckle. Debbie, is this for real? You know April Fool's isn't for 3 months, right? The list had the usual things: people getting their food stolen by wildlife, guests losing things on the trail, guests losing people on the trail that usually showed up about the time we went to serve the complaint, and one that stood above the rest. January 25th, guest at Hetero Campsite reported someone driving some sort of vehicle, possibly an ATV or a Land Cruiser, late at night. When they went to confront the driver, who was getting close to a tent where they had 2 small children, they discovered what appeared to be an older model ATV driving through the woods with no driver. No, I don't think so. The lady who called it in last night sounded really upset about it. You're serious. This lady thinks she saw an ATV with no one riding it. That's what she said, Debbie said, cleaning up as she tried to get out the door. She called back about an hour ago to see if anybody was coming out to check on it. I sighed. It was probably just campers who had tipped the bottle a little too much before turning in. I cursed the fact that I was the only one on today. We were always short-staffed these days. It would be another day of talking to people who would insist what they saw was real and yell at me for not doing anything more than taking notes. Still, it would probably prove to be over quickly, so I headed to the Hetero Campsite. I wanted to get this one out of the way, having no idea what I was getting into. The woman, Mrs. Rast, did have 2 small children, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and she also had a half-full bottle of wine that seemed to be more important at the time. She had set up a little tent near the corner of the site, and the cooler of food she had by the flap was likely going to lead to her next report being for a bear encounter. Mrs. Rast looked well enough, her children looking a little dirty, but not malnourished, but I suspected that she might be living rough while the weather was nice. She wouldn't be here much longer, not if that cold front came through like it was supposed to, and I wondered how well her ghost ATV would run in the cold. I was just setting in, the babies were sleeping, and all of a sudden I hear some kind of engine coming up through the brush. I sat up pretty quick because, for one, it was about 2 in the morning, and for 2, it was getting awful close to the tent. And if some fool was driving on a scooter or something in the dark, they might hit my tent and hurt somebody. So I went out to holler at them, and that's when I saw it. It was a white ATV, blue and red stripes up the side, and as it sped by, I saw that no one was riding on it. It went off into the woods, pretty as you please, and just kept going. That's when you called the ranger station, I asked, making notes and trying to ignore the strong smell of wine on her breath. Of course. Who else would I call out here in the woods? Smokey the Bear? I stifled a laugh. She wasn't wrong. Thank you very much, ma'am. We'll look into it. The woman thanked me and said that she would call if she had anything else happen. I spent the rest of the day looking into the other calls, and when I finally got back to the station, the lettuce on my BLT was wilted, and my hash browns had become distinctly soggy. I was munching on my BT, minus the L, when Ranger Forrest came in. Ranger Forrest had been doing this for about 5 years longer than me, and had heard all the jokes about a park ranger named Forrest. He looked at the limp lettuce on the napkin on my desk and picked up a bit to take a bite. He made a face. Past its prime, to be sure, but it ought to be a crime to eat a BLT without lettuce. You can take it up with the Phantom ATV, I guess. It started all this today. Ranger Forrest let the lettuce fall back on the paper towel, looking like he'd seen a ghost. What did it look like? He asked, trying to make his face look normal again and failing. Well, I didn't see it, personally, but the lady said it was white with a red and blue stripe on it. He just stood there for a second, and when I shook him, he seemed to come back to himself. You okay? What happened there? Where was it? What? The ATV, I said, almost laughing. His eyes were deadly serious when he asked me again. Where did you see it? By the Hetero campsite. Forrest, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I didn't, he hedged, but maybe she did. He took a seat, picking up another piece of the wilted lettuce and nibbled at it. You gonna tell me what you mean, or am I gonna have to guess? He let me sit for a few more seconds before he started his story. About 3 years ago, I got a call to go check on an ATV accident near the Hetero site. Some kids had driven their ATVs into the park, coming up some kind of back trail to get there, and one of them had been hot-dogging and gotten himself hurt real bad. Well, it's not entirely accurate. The kid had gotten himself real dead. He'd been driving too fast and gone under a tree, and it had taken his head clean off. He had never seen it coming, apparently, and he'd been going fast enough that it snapped his neck and lopped his head off. His friends were standing around looking pale and embarrassed to be anywhere near those vehicles. I remember to this day that the kid's eyes were still moving when I got there. His head was off, his blood making a streak on the side of the ATV, and his eyes were still tracking like he could see us. He focused on me when I got close, his eyes seeming to beg me to fix him, and then they stopped. It's the ATV that I remember too, though. It was white with a blue streak, and his blood seemed to make another one below that, a long red one. I'll never forget that, loading that bike into the back of the police trailer and seeing the blood flake off as it bumped the side. I didn't say anything for a minute, just watched him sit there and chew cud before reading him the description of the bike. The lady thought it might just be a regular red streak, but I didn't see it, and she saw it on the move, so she could be wrong. The one thing she was clear about was that no one was riding it. Forrest nodded. Well, it would be hard to drive one without a head, I guess. We talked a little more before he said he needed to get back to work. I had a small mountain of paperwork to handle, and by the time I looked up, it was dark out. I checked my watch and found that it was only 7, but it was the right time of year for an early evening. I had just bent back to my work, wondering when my relief was going to get there, when I heard something come over the radio. It made me jump a little. It had been so quiet up until that point. And when they hailed the station again, I walked over to the handset and picked it up. Base 3 here, go ahead. We have a call about the Hetero camp. Something about an illegal vehicle near the site. Would you go take a look? Roger, I'll head out there. Touch base with Ranger Forrest and see if he's in the area. I might need help. The dispatcher said that they would, and I grabbed my radio and headed for my own vehicle, my sturdy little Bobcat. I shivered as I set out, feeling the chill as it hit against my jacket and wishing I had put on my earmuffs. It was chilly enough for snow, and I was glad that I didn't have to deal with any of that. As I came up the service road towards the campsite, I could hear something racing along, but it could have been from an ATV or a dirt bike. As I got closer, I could see people coming out of their tents to look at it, and Mrs. Rast was in attendance with her 2 kids. Whatever it was racing along the tree line beside the campground, and it was going full throttle at a suicidal rate. It started about a half an hour ago, Mrs. Rast said, running up when she saw me pull up. If it's someone out there, they're going to get killed if they keep running like that. As she said it, the engine suddenly died, and whatever had been driving out there stopped. Everyone, stay with your tents. Don't leave the area. I'm going to go see if I can find the driver, but I don't want anyone to get hurt if they start hot rodding again. They made non-committal noises, and most of them went back to their tents. I dug my mag light out of my supply hatch and walked into the copse of trees. The trees were thin enough that I should be able to see if someone was back there, especially if they were on a vehicle of some kind. It was dark, but there was enough light out here that visibility was pretty good. The flashlight hit the pathetic line of trees, showing me a bunch of scrub pines and thin oaks, but no ATV or rider. There was little and less to go on here, and I was ready to give up when I heard something come to life to my left. I was suddenly in the yellow headlights of an ancient ATV, the paint job looking more yellow than white. The blue stripe was a light blue, very cheery, but the other stripe was no more than a faded red and brown. I saw all of this in a split second, right before it came barreling towards me. I jumped out of the way, barely avoided being struck, and when it rolled off into the woods, I heard a gasp and was blinded by the beam of a flashlight. Forrest moved the light a moment later, and he was white as a sheet. That's the one. The very same ATV. I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. We walked back to our bobcats, me holding him up a little as we went. He took a week off after that, said he needed to clear his head. I picked up the slack, understanding how these kinds of things can get to you. Moths, trains, lighthouses, and now phantom ATVs. What is this place coming to? It's less of a memory and more of a hazy sort of dream. I dream it so often that I have to believe it's real, and it never ceases to wake me in a state of terror. I'm standing on my grandparents' cracked carport, their old Ford Aerostar parked on it as it makes twin walkways to the door that leads inside. At first I thought I was sitting or walking on my knees, but then I realized I'm just very small. This must have happened when I was younger, 2 or 3 maybe, and my steps are a little unsteady as I toddle along. I can see the normal collection of carport junk as it slides by my field of vision. An old bike, a leaf blower, some lawn chairs, and I seem to be making my way towards a large rusty grill that's near the back of the carport. I can almost feel the sleek surface of that van as I slide my fingers along it. I was drawing pictures in the road dirt, the mud and dust that cling to a vehicle, and I was making little waves with my finger as I walked along. I turned to draw a dolphin as he jumped out of the water, his mouth open and smiling, and that was when I saw it. It crawled from under the front of the van, slow and deliberate, and I turned my head as it came into my peripherals. The spider looks absolutely massive to me. It's roughly the size of a human hand, and it's stretched out and looking at me as if it can't believe it's seen me either. He wiggles his pinchers at me, and I felt a shiver run through me as I felt his regard. I feel a sense of dread that has no place in a child that young. Even then, I knew that I didn't want this thing to come near me. I had a real case of arachnophobia when I was younger, and I think this might have been what started it. I didn't like rubber spiders, pipe cleaners that form the shape of spiders, or anything that was even vaguely spider-shaped. I would have rather cut my hand off than hold a living spider, and even just seeing a plastic one or a picture of a spider in a book was enough to make my skin crawl. I remember this one taking a step toward me, and I took a step back from it as that feeling of fear spread through me. It was deliciously invasive, a feeling I would later chase through haunted houses and dark movie theaters. But with all the life experience that a 2 or 3-year-old can have, it was something I didn't like. It made me think of the sounds I sometimes heard in the closet, under the bed, outside my bedroom window, Anywhere else, there might be a monster when the lights were out. It took another step, and then another, and then another, and I backed away on unsteady legs. I know now that it probably had no intention of hurting me. It was probably just curious. But in the dream, I am certain, with the logic only a child can hold, that this creature will end my life. The spider would bite me and put some devious poison into me. It would grow to towering heights and swallow me whole. It would wrap me up in a cocoon and drag me off so it could drain my blood, like the spiders did in my animal books, and 1,000 other terrible things. These are things that adults know are impossible, but children know not only can happen, but have happened 1,000 times before. I backpedaled in the dream, moving away as I kept my hands on the smooth surface of the van. But suddenly, disaster struck. I stumbled, falling backward onto my butt and hands, and I cry out as the pavement takes its toll on the flesh of my smooth, unblemished hand. I was momentarily distracted by the pain in my hand, and then I looked up, as if suddenly remembering the spider. For a moment, I cannot see it, and that fills me with relief. It's moved off. It's gone after tastier prey, and now I can get away from the carport at a more leisurely pace. Then I twitch my foot to the side, and there it is, clicking its pincers menacingly as it stares at me. I cry out in fear, and then someone cries out behind me as they call my name. I'm momentarily startled, their voice echoing in the carport, and then I'm scooped up and pulled out of danger by strong, assuring hands. The spider is suddenly miles below me, a toy or a stain on the concrete instead of a threat. And as whoever has picked me up brings a large black house shoe down on the spider, it becomes an actual stain on the concrete. I always wake up as they babble nonsense to me, and no matter how many times I have the dream, it never makes much sense. So the last time I was at my grandmother's house, I asked her about it. She just laughed. God, I'm surprised you can remember that far back. Yeah, it happened right out there on the carport. You were playing outside while I gardened, and I saw you toddle into the carport and didn't think anything of it. You've never hurt yourself out there before, so I figured I'd just let you play. When you yelled, I came on the run to see what had happened. You were sitting there, crying, and right by your foot was the biggest wolf spider I've ever seen. He was no tarantula, but he could have definitely bit you and made it hurt. My protective nature kicked in, and I stomped him before I could even think about it. I usually leave them alone. It's bad luck to kill a spider, but this one had menaced my grandbaby, and I couldn't have that. It was kind of weird to realize that a dream I'd had for years and years was something that had actually happened. Makes me wonder if I've had other dreams that might be real as well. We were sitting in the living room, watching the sludgy rain come down as it tried to harden into snow. The seasons were changing, but They were also slow to do so here in Appalachia. The forecast had called for a little heat spell this weekend, if you could call 60 a heat spell, I guess, and Grandpa had somehow convinced me that we needed an early spring camping trip. I had been understandably hesitant. Grandpa's cough had been staying at its normal level and output, and the breathing treatments didn't seem to be helping. They were stopping it from getting any worse, but they really weren't making it any better. Grandpa swore it was just a winter chill, and once it got hot again, he would kick it, but like last year, I wasn't so sure. But I had been interested in some camping, so I'd agreed. Now, the storm had rolled in for the next few days, and it kept us out of the woods and Glimmer in her cave as she prepared to re-winterize her people's home. Glimmer seemed to have taken on a much larger role for her people, and she was working with the Queen directly from what I understood. I was proud of her, but it sometimes took her away for days on end, and I missed her something fierce. Grandpa was sulking, sitting in his chair and looking away from me with his arms crossed like a pouting child. He had still wanted to go, been adamant that we should go, but I couldn't get him out there and risk him getting pneumonia. I could get him out of the woods, but he might still do his lungs a mischief, and I didn't know how many more trips to the hospital the old guy had in him, ghost attacks aside. We had argued a bit. He had threatened to go by himself, but finally, he had understood where I was coming from and agreed not to go off on his own. That didn't mean he liked it, and he was now grumbling darkly to himself. "Are you still grumbling?" I asked, looking up from my phone. I was looking forward to this trip too, but the weather isn't exactly amenable to our trip. Grandpa made a dismissive sound. "Peh, I used to camp in all kinds of weather. Rain, snow, sleet, hail." "You sure you were a trucker?" I said. "Sounds like you were a mailman." He laughed, the first genuine laugh I had gotten out of him in a while. "Shoot, I was hunting in weather like this when I saw the Pale Men gathering." I raised an eyebrow. "The Pale Men? Haven't heard of them before." "Well, I tell you what, you make me a cup of that hot honey tea that I like, and I'll tell you all about 'em." I laughed. I would have made him tea anyway, but I went over to the kitchen and got out the lemon tea he liked, added honey and peppermint, and boiled it till it was fragrant enough to make me want a cup too. I brought it to him, and he mmm'd appreciatively as he took a sip, the steam wafting up across his face as he tested the hotness. He must have found it to be a little too warm for more than an experimental sip, because he set it aside and folded his hands in his lap. "This was a little before Easter, probably a week before, and I'd gone to the woods to catch my family something for a meal. I was after pheasant or maybe an early year turkey, but I would have lugged home a deer or boar just the same. Your mother was about 6, your uncle 4, and your mother was finally old enough to help your grandma take care of some house chores and her younger sibling. Your grandma told me to bring home something nice and kissed me on the cheek, and off I headed with some supplies and my rifle. The weather was mild, the last of the snows having dried up weeks ago, and I intended to sleep rough for a couple of nights and then come back with something for a fine Easter dinner. What I got was a sudden spring storm that left me taking shelter under a copse of trees that I'd tied together with twine. The rain was cold, and it was coming down in buckets. It was too wet to even think about a fire. I was forced to use my game bag as improvised cover, and I sat miserable and wet as the rain dripped through my canopy and onto my back. It was dark out, the moon shining down sporadically through the trees, when the clouds parted, and I was just thinking about maybe trying to slog home through the dark when I saw something. Not 20 feet away, springing suddenly to life like a light bulb had been flipped on, a fire came to life, and the sounds of a party met my ears. It was a real swinging party, too. There was music, though I didn't see any instruments, and it seemed to dance around my head like a swarm of fairies. They had a table set up with food and wine. The meats were smoking, fresh from whatever fire they had used to cook them, and they had set out the most fantastic things I had ever seen. Candied chestnuts that were still in the shell, puddings with strawberry fish swimming across them, great piles of chocolate, many kinds I had never even known existed. The table was laid heavy with food and drink, and the revelers were no less unique. They were tall and pale, their clothes looking regal and airy. I was in awe of them, their features sharp as any painting from ages past. They were loud, their laughter echoing through the forest, and they seemed unbothered by the rain. There in the glade, I realized there was no rain, and they were swaying and dancing like drunks as they spoke to each other. Their language was strange, and it had too many syllables for my ears to make sense of, but they understood it well enough. They laughed and sang, taking small bites here and there of the food and drinking deeply from their goblets. They were a merry group indeed, and as I sat in the cold and watched them, I seethed in silent hatred of them. Why should they stand in comfort while I sat in the rain? It was unfair. It was unchristian of them not to invite me out of the rain to their party, and I sat smelling the food and listening to their chatter. I decided finally that I would go see who these people were. I wasn't afraid of them. I wasn't afraid of much in these woods, and I believed I could defend myself if they decided they meant to harm me. I had faced forest creatures before and come out on top, but I was about to learn something new that night. I had taken a single step from my lean-to when I heard something coming up the trail to my left. I got low, sliding soundlessly back into my concealing copse of trees, but the rain would cover any sound I was making. I saw two more of the pale things coming up, carrying a wooden frame between them, and attached to that frame was a person. He was naked from the waist up, his pants wet and clinging to him, and someone had stuffed a rag into his mouth deep enough that I could hear him choking. He was struggling, trying to get away, but they had tied him up pretty well. He could see the gathering of creatures ahead, and they made him struggle all the more. One of the creatures carrying him said something to the others, and they turned and clapped, their applause moving through the silent forest like a condemnation. They stuck the corners of the wooden frame into the ground and held it there as the man struggled and begged them to let him go. He said he wouldn't tell, that he wouldn't say anything, that he hadn't seen anything, and if they just let him go, he'd never come back to these woods, or any woods, ever again. I didn't recognize him, which I suppose was a blessing. If he had been someone from town, and I'd been forced to see his family as they mourned him, it might have been more than I could bear. The creatures gathered around him, poking at him and laughing at him, and when one of them raised his hand for silence, I prepared to make my move. They hadn't seen me. They probably didn't even know I was there. I could throw a shield in front of him. I could shove them all away. I could set them on fire. All my plans leaked out of me when the one with his hands raised began to change. He turned his head, the moon coming out to perfectly frame him in its light, and I saw the sides of his mouth rip open like a snake. Inside were rows and rows of needle-sharp teeth, a triple layer of lightly packed sewing needles that seemed to gleam in the light of the full moon. He turned and looked at the crowd, and I could see his eyes had become cat-like, sideways, slitted. He said something to them, the words changing as they passed through those odd teeth, before turning and biting the man just above the left nipple. The man screamed, of course he did, and the creatures came away with nothing but red covering those teeth. He didn't tear flesh from the man, he just stabbed him with his pointy teeth, ripping into his skin, and then turned to invite the others to do likewise. Suddenly, the glade was full of ripping and tearing, their mouths coming open as their faces tore, and soon they were all gathering around him, biting and gnashing their teeth. The marks were terrible, the flesh red and purple as they sank those teeth into him again and again. He writhed in agony, his eyes roving as he begged them to stop, begged God to help him. And as they kept biting him, the two of us locked eyes. He saw me in my hiding place, and his eyes begged me for help. I wouldn't, though. Couldn't, though. I'm no coward. You know that, but I was afraid. What if my magic did nothing to those creatures? What if they shrugged it off and came for me? What if they sank those teeth into me too, again and again, and didn't stop till I was just half-chewed meat? I didn't know what to do. I'd never encountered anything like this, and there were so many of them. My mind raced. I was shaking in my cold little hole as they killed this man. When they finally stepped away from him, it was too late to do much of anything. The man had been bitten so much that his skin looked bruised. They'd bled him like a hog. As he hung there, one of them bit his throat out, and I cringed from the sight as they drank his blood. They lapped at him like dogs, and as they did, I scrunched down in my hiding spot and put my hands over my mouth as I tried not to scream. If they heard me, they would do the same to me. I was scared of never coming back, of just disappearing into the forest. But I was even more afraid that these things would find my family. I hadn't known that they existed till tonight, but suddenly I felt less comfortable than I ever had in the woods. I lay there, moving as little as possible, till the rain finally stopped. I looked up then, slowly rising to my knees, and found that dawn was approaching. I also found that the table and the revelers that had magically appeared had just as magically departed. I got my gun, I got my things, and I got the hell out of there. On the way home, by some turn of luck, I scrambled across a half-decent sized grouse that had gotten its leg broken by a fallen tree limb. I put it out of its misery and popped it into my game bag. I didn't want to think about it too much. Seeing its bleeding wounds where its head had once been made me think of the man I had stood by and allowed to die.
All in all, it was a good Easter, but I never stayed in the woods during a full moon ever again. I looked at your grandma's book, something I'd brought me a little piece once I found the right passage, and discovered that Grandma had seen them too. She called them pale men, and they only held their feasts on the night of the full moon. They would take travelers and bums from the road and use them for their revels. She too was careful never to go into the woods during a full moon. I still think about it sometimes. I think about it, and it fills me with shame. It was the only time I ever stood by and did nothing after I became a man, and I swore that the next time I was privy to such a thing, I would be braver. I was the protector of this area in many ways, and I vowed to never stand by and just watch as someone was hurt ever again.
The rain came down as we both sat in silence. My tea had gone cold, as had Gramps'. I shook my head as I blew out a whistle. Jesus, Grandpa, why would you tell me a story like that? He glanced at me, his eyes a little condescending.
Why do I tell you anything, kid? So that when I'm dust in the ground, you can know things, know them, and use them to help to help other people.
I went to get Grandpa's cup, meaning to warm it up, and that's when I noticed the moon through the clouds as it peeked through the window. It was full, swollen to the rim, and shining wetly upon the hills of Appalachia. Somewhere in those woods, someone could be losing their life tonight, a victim of the pale men and their strange revels. I tried not to shudder as I took his cup to the stove, but Grandpa, as usual, took notice. She walked from the coffee shop, swaying as she went, and smiling as others noticed. May liked to be noticed, liked to be seen. On a whim, she bent down to put her mouth against the ear of a man sitting on a bench. He was reading a newspaper, not noticing the goddess that walked just behind him, and when he felt her presence, he started to move away. When she spoke, however, he went rigid, and his face took on a dreamy look.
That's the right choice, Dale. The stock will make you thousands.
Dale nodded, turning back to the paper he was reading, and looked pleased as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He was calling his broker. She knew it. And as she moved down the street, she could feel that she was getting closer to her next target. It was a woman. She knew that, but she wouldn't know her until she saw her. She was jouncing up the sidewalk, her heels clicking on the concrete, and as she went around the corner, she saw her sitting at a cafe up ahead. "There you are," she purred as she came clocking up the row, unaware that unfriendly eyes were on her. Someone was marking her path, but she couldn't feel him. Not yet. The woman was sitting outside a cafe, and May could see her erasing something with the stylus that she was using. It was a dress. She was designing something, and she could feel her irritation from here. Whatever she was drawing, it didn't seem to be going well, and when May bent down beside her, the woman jumped as she spoke to her. "Don't stress it, Jamie. You know what you want to make, and you know how it should look." The girl eased back down, smiling as she began working on her dress again. It was going to look so good at the gala next week, and Jamie would be able to stop taking any old job that came by and start working for herself. She was still working in that happy daydream as May walked off, heading towards the subtle pull of her next inspiration. The man kept a safe distance, not wanting to spook her. It had taken him years to track this one down, and he wasn't going to lose her at the end of the chase. She was a thorn in his side, and he would have all of this inspiration brought to an end, just as he had before. May mingled with the crowd, her shadow losing her for a moment, and May leaned her head back as she soaked up the sun of the early afternoon. Boston could be a dreary place, but May seemed to step into every beam of sunlight and find every gust of fresh air. This was her providence, her right, and she strutted along as she turned hearts and heads with her words and her presence. It had always been like this for her, for as long as she could remember, and she could remember a good long time. May had been young when the world was new. She had walked upon the skin of the earth since the gods worshipped by the people were as numerous as the stars. They did not worship her, not really, but they sought her favor. She didn't like to think of them as worshippers anyway, more admirers. They loved to love her, to call to her, to ask her favor, and some of them became her paramours. She touched them, and they were inspired, as it had always been. She was making her way to the next source of inspiration when something happened that made her cold in her nethers. She felt the desire to inspire these mortals like a steady heartbeat through a vein. The need to enlighten, to better them, ran through her head like a living current, and she always wondered if this had been what caused the downfall of Prometheus. Did he feel that pulse too? That need to inspire so deep within him that he gave the humans that first spark of godly wisdom and was damned for it? Who knew? No one seemed to know where any of those ancient squabblers had gone to, if they had existed at all. May couldn't say, but she thought she had known once. She shook her head. She was scattering again. The pulse going through the vein of creativity was thrumming like an angry tooth. It was like a blood vessel with an occlusion, and she could feel it threatening to dam. But then it began to slowly push again, sending the inspiration back to the source. That could mean only one thing. It meant he was back at work. May quickened her steps, apologizing as she bumped someone, and whispered a powerful hunch about the stock market as she put out a hand to stop him from falling. If that old devil was up to his tricks again, then she needed to get scarce. If he so much as sniffed her, doing what she had been made to do, then she would be just another puff of dust in the wind. The world needed muses, angelic and otherworldly, and there were very few of her kind left. She could be the last, for all she knew, and that was a sobering thought. She came around the corner, seeing the park where her next inspiration sat, but It was who he was talking to that made her pull up short. He was talking to one of them. A demon had touched him. The youth was handsome, his suit well-tailored, his kinky black hair cut tight to his head, and his smile was like to charm the birdies from the trees. He was young, younger than most who trucked with devils, but that was undoubtedly what he was doing. He was offering the man his hand, a contract between them, and as they shook, it was like Zeus himself had thrown a thunderbolt into her skull. The connection between them sputtered, severed at the artery, and she stumbled into someone as she took hold of a nearby fence. That was when she felt it. She was collecting her wits, trying to get moving again, but she had felt the eyes of a hunter on her. It was him. It was the smiling devil, and she glanced behind her as if expecting to see that old reaper grinning from the crowd. She didn't, but she knew he was there. He would get her if she wasn't careful, and she needed to be careful. She needed to move, to leave town, to go somewhere else, but she was stumbling. Her head hurt so much, and as she stepped onto the road, someone pulled her back onto the sidewalk an instant before a taxi would have splattered her. "You okay, miss?" the man asked. She looked up and saw the man with the guitar as he looked at her hopefully. He was a musician, a busker, with a part-time job at a local bistro, but she could see the potential. He could be great. He could be very good. And when she kissed him, his apprehension melted away as she pushed her divine inspiration into him. In a few days, he would write a song. A few weeks after that, he would get a standing ovation at the bistro when he sang it on a whim. And a year later, he would be offered a contract by a major label as his song continued to see popularity, both online and off. He would never have to suffer for his art again, and that might even make her death worth something if it came today. "Thank you for the save, handsome," she said, flitting into the crowd like a spooked deer as he stood and watched her go in confusion and gratitude. She fled, her mind racing with the best course of escape, but no matter how far she went, the eyes were always on her. She began to catch glimpses of him, that dark-suited rogue. He stared at her behind the glass window of a bakery. He glared at her from an alleyway. He grinned at her from beneath the canopy of a bistro, and then walked toward her with a crowd that was escaping from a crowded bus. She backpedaled, looked for an escape, and saw the alley. She ducked down it, running as she looked behind her, and when she crashed into the wall, she felt her teeth come together painfully. Trapped, dead end, and the shadow that blotted out the late afternoon sun was absolute. "Well, well, well," he said, his boots clumping on the pavement as he approached her. "It seems like every time I kill one of you, another pops up. It's beginning to feel like squashing cockroaches." She was desperate, looking around like a trapped rat, but she could find no escape. She stumbled left, feigning a turned ankle, but he didn't fall for it. When she corrected and eeled to the right to get around him, his hand came out and pinned her to the wall by the throat. The uneven bricks bit into her skin, and she writhed as he held her there. No one came to her aid. No one saw them down the shadowy alley, and if they did, they pretended not to. City people were friendly. Well, friendly enough, but they had gotten used to not getting involved in things that were not their business. You are nearly as insufferable as my angelic counterparts, but easier to kill by far, he growled. Please, she wheezed, his fingers cutting off the air. Mercy! Mercy for my competition. Why should I? I've done you no harm. I've never stolen from you or hurt you in any way. The old devil rolled his eyes. Your kind always say this, but then you steal my money and hurt my business. It hardly matters anyway. Our kind have fought since time was young. Please, she hissed. Please, I... She floundered, but her words were stolen as he leaned in close. Enough. I'm done talking. He pressed his mouth close to hers, looking like some old corpse with his purchased woman. But as their eyes locked, she felt her power slipping from her. He was drawing her inspiration from her. He was draining her of her reason to be, and she could feel herself shriveling. He was draining her, her life flitting away, and as she fell to dust, he let her go and watched her float away. Lucifer Jones came slowly up the alley behind him, watching the dust sift away in the breeze. Did you sort your business out, boss? Mr. Seraph watched the remains slip silently away, feeling her power fill him, enhancing his own surplus of bought talent. The muses could be annoying, those ancient whisperers of a bygone age, but their power could always be counted on to supplement his own. It would bolster the deal that Lucifer had struck today, once they drew it out, and Mr. Seraph smiled as he thought of the wealth to be made from such a talent. I did, Mr. Jones. I trust you have sealed the deal with Mr. Ferris. Was it ever in any doubt? He's coming to the office this evening. Excellent, Mr. Seraph intoned. In the meantime, I believe I might like some dinner. The chase, you see, always leaves me ravenous. When I was in college, I got involved with a paranormal research group through a friend of mine. We'll call him M. M knew I had a general interest in the occult, something that would flourish as my time in Georgia went on, and had decided that I was a sensitive, someone who could feel spirits. I don't know if I could or not, but he was insistent enough for both of us, so I went along with it. M was, of course, our occult expert. At the time, I thought M knew a lot of things and had some kind of otherworldly knowledge about the avenues of occult workings, but he ultimately turned out to be a really good grifter. He curated this mystique about him that was alluring to a certain type of woman, and it helped him bounce from bed to bed in the 3 or 4 years that I knew him. We were joined in our ghost hunting adventures by a woman named Eva, who is still doing ghost hunting in North Georgia to this day, as far as I know. She had a lot of equipment for ghost hunting, things she had picked up from previous failed groups, and was our resident tech head. I'm pretty sure that she and M were together, though maybe not officially, and we stayed in touch after the group broke up. Our fourth was a guy named Simon, who kind of reminded me of Dib from Invader Zim, though I'm not sure he was doing it on purpose. He fancied himself a cryptozoologist, and was also a wealth of information when it came to conspiracy theories. He believed everything from alien abductions to the FBI's assassination of JFK, and you couldn't convince him that any of it was anything but gospel. He was friends with M, and it sort of made M our de facto leader. We rode around in his mom's white minivan, Mystery Inc. style, and helped people who were experiencing strange activity. We did this for about 6 months before Eva and M began to argue and Simon graduated and moved to Pennsylvania. We had some fun times in those 6 months, though. Most of it was curiosity work, standing in cemeteries and taking pictures to get spirit orbs, taking recordings to hear sounds, and the usual kind of things ghost hunters do. There's a few other standouts. I might tell you about them sometime, but the one I want to talk about is the case I remember as the smokehouse. The smokehouse was unique because it was one of the few cases we had that made me think what happened might have been our fault. The family that lived there was called the Fosters. Mary and Kevin, not their real names, but close enough. They were recommended to us by a professor at college, a friend of theirs. They had recently noticed a strange smell in their house that no one could explain. They had been to electricians, home inspectors, and contractors, and they had all kinds of inspections and offers and such, but no real answers. They'd come to the professor, and he had come to us. Their son died a year ago, and they're afraid that his spirit might be haunting the place. I don't know why they've come to this conclusion, but they want someone to take a look who knows what they're doing. We pulled up to their house at about 6:30, just as the sun was getting low. M said that it would be more mysterious if we arrived at sunset, which might cast us in shadows, so we'd look more legitimate. M always seemed more interested in optics than actually doing anything. The couple was older, maybe late 50s or early 60s, and they showed us in with smiles and questions about drinks and food. Some of us ate, some of us drank, and we all listened to what they had to say. "We've lived here for 40 years, bought it when we were newlyweds. Andrew, our son, was born here. Didn't quite make it to the hospital, so the wife had him right here in the kitchen. He lived here until he was 19, when he decided he wanted to be a firefighter. We were proud, but not very hopeful. Andrew had tried to go into the Army and was refused. Tried to get into the police academy the year before, but just couldn't make it. Now, it was firefighter school. We figured that this would make 3, but he excelled at it. He got into shape, he learned the material, and not long after, he was a firefighter." The woman sobbed a little, looking down into her coffee cup before her husband continued. "Our son was a firefighter for nearly a decade, until he died in a fire trying to save a family from a collapsing building. They brought us his fire coat and his helmet, and we brought it home and made a little remembrance wall. It's in my wife's sewing room now, along with a picture of him, and we find it a great comfort. A couple of months after he died, the smell began. It's a smoky smell. I'm sure you smelled it since you came in. The others have smelled it too, but none of them can find it or make it stop. We've tried to get rid of it through normal means, so now we're attempting to get rid of it through less conventional means. We'll pay you if you can figure out how it's doing this." So we set to work. Eva set up some cameras and microphones, Simon helping her, and M and I set about being sensitives. M would ask me what I felt, and I would tell him what came to mind. He would always nod, eyes closed, and then tell me what it meant like some pocket sage. He always understood what it meant, understood with that maddening way of his, and I just kind of accepted it. I didn't sense much, scuffling in the attic that turned out to be squirrels, the hum of the washing machine, a slight creak that could be nothing more than the house settling, but nothing of any substance. It was usually like that, but any little thing always meant something mystical, that M could hear phantom voices and the rattling of an old water heater, but we never really questioned him. Questioning in that community was frowned upon. If you called someone out on their bullshit, then they'd call you out on yours. We were all just trying to see what we could do to be real magicians, I guess, hoping it would be us that was the next Luke Skywalker or Harry Potter. We all wanted to be special, but we mostly just looked ridiculous. After about 3 hours, Eva hadn't gotten any audio or video, and I hadn't felt much more than the hum of the washing machine. We were at a loss for the smell, something all of us had to admit that we were smelling, but of course, M had the answer. He went to the memorial wall and pointed to it, nodding as he wove his hands before it. "There's a spirit attached to this coat. He is displeased at being deceased before his time, and what you're smelling is his spirit. I'll tie a charm to it and put a circle of salt around it, so that the spirit might disconnect on its own. Do I have your permission to move it?" The Fosters said that he did, and he took it down as he moved it to a spot on the floor. He looked at it and then added the helmet, too, before encircling the whole thing in salt. He held his hands out once he was done, speaking low before raising his voice and speaking to whatever spirit he believed had attached itself to the jacket. "Spirit, I beseech you to move on. Your life here is no more. You must go to whatever lies beyond. Be gone from this house. You are welcome here no more." Then he spouted some pseudo-Latin at it and forked the sign of the evil eye. There was no pillar of fire, no unearthly laughter, and we all just stood there and watched the coat, ignoring the blackened marks on the arms. When he was satisfied, M told them that if the smoke smell came back again, they should call us immediately. If it hasn't come back in 3 days, then you can hang the coat and the helmet back on the wall. They thanked him, and when he slipped his hand into his pocket, I realized they had given him money. When he climbed back into the van, and M decided not to comment on it, I realized he didn't mean to tell us about it, though. 2 days later, I got a call. It wasn't from the Fosters, it was from the police. They had M down at the station, and they wanted the rest of us to come down too. Apparently, the Fosters were dead, and their house had burned to the ground. "We understand that you and your friends were there the day before. Do you mind if we ask you what you were doing at the Fosters' house?" I explained what it was our group did, but the officer in charge of my questioning just scoffed. "So you didn't do anything? Is that what you're telling us?" "Yes, sir. I have left nothing in the house, and when we got in our van, the Fosters were still very much alive." He nodded, taking a picture out and putting it on the table. "Does this look familiar?" It was a little grainy, but it was clearly the remains of the coat that M had circled in salt. The charm was still attached to it, and the salt around it was undisturbed. "That's their son's coat, the one who died. My friend M put a circle of salt around it and affixed a charm to it because he believed that a spirit was attached to it. Neither are flammable, and we in no way started that fire." They had a few more questions, but they ultimately had to let us go. There was no proof that we'd done anything, but go in and play pretend for about 4 hours, and they had to turn us loose. We all decided not to talk about it again, but I think we all realized that something had happened there that night. We had made something angry, and it had killed that nice old couple because of it. We had not been the cause, not really, but we had also. If we had let it go, they'd probably be alive today, while still dealing with a smoky smell. After that, we were a little more careful about how we interacted with spirits. Actions, after all, have consequences. "Are you sure that's what you heard?" Tobias asked. I nodded. "I am. I'm also certain that one of them was Wysanther." Tobias sighed. "That doesn't bode well. Wysanther isn't the strongest of the summer court, but he is strong. The queens sit at the top of the court, then the maids, then the knights. The knights are an extension of the queens and their court, so they owe their title and power to the queens. He has to know that by working against Titania, he's playing a very dangerous game. The courts are full of intrigue, but going against the queens is exceptionally foolish. Which means he's pretty sure that when it's discovered, that he has a way out. Or a better offer, Tobias said. Is there anything we can do with this information? Tobias shook his head. Not without evidence. At the moment, all we have is hearsay. Sometimes I think it might be easier if we just gacked him ourselves and got on with it. That was about the time our meeting was interrupted by an alarm from one of our newest security detail. The Brandylow who came to get me was called Saramir, and she was young, even by Brandylow standard. She had come in a few weeks ago. She claimed that a Brandylow with short dark hair had met her and told her it was time he gave her his power. That sounded like Xandolin, and I was definitely sorry to hear that he was no more. He was a good Brandylow, and Saramir was becoming a pretty good one too. She was hard-working, didn't shy away from difficult tasks, and kept her complaints to herself. So when she came running in, the club swinging from her belt, and told me that a scary man was standing by the lily pond, I sighed. I knew who she must mean, but I'd hoped he would be a little more patient than this. He knew the lady had gone, and he knew that it was she who did his dirty work for him. He couldn't expect Tobias and I to do the same service for him. Could he? I'll go speak with him, I said, Tobias nodding and telling me to be safe. Remind him that the deal he made is dependent on the lady, and that we would be unable to fulfill it without her. He might have to kill his own meat in the meantime. I nodded, exactly what I had been thinking. I straightened my robes, checked my cudgel, and set out to speak with the warden of Stragview. He was standing by the lily pond and looking at the statue that we'd made of her. It looked almost identical to the one that she had been trapped in, and it made my heart feel heavy every time I saw it. It was a great accent piece for the lily pond, but it was also a great reminder of what I hoped we would find again. The warden was looking at her as if willing her into reality, and when he turned to me, I could see him putting his smile back in place. Brandylow, good to see you again. I'd like to say the feeling is mutual, I returned, putting a hand on my cudgel handle. What are you doing in my garden? Is it your garden now? Did you take it over when your mistress was taken? For the time being, yes. I'm keeping it warm for her is all. So again, what are you doing in my garden? We hadn't received any details of inmates since the lady was taken, but the snow had probably been keeping most of the larger vehicles off the road. Perhaps he was here to tell us that the details would be coming back again, but I kind of doubted it. He was more likely to tell us that he wanted something done about a particularly bad inmate, but if that was the case, he was in for some disappointment. I have 3 new death row inmates, and I've become tired of dealing with the shenanigans of one particularly nasty fellow. His execution date isn't for months, maybe even years, but his daily performances are starting to be problematic for morale. I need him gone, and I need it sooner rather than later. I pursed my lips. I understand that your death house is infested, but can't you do anything for yourself? What about the woods? Can't you let the woods take care of him? The warden shook his head. The forest is no longer a viable option. There are things there that I cannot trust to do the job. I cannot be seen to kill him myself, or my staff would lose faith in me. Every other gambit we have attempted hasn't panned out, and so
I need you all to live up to your side of the deal. The deal. I hadn't counted on that. If we wanted the warden's help, then we had to maintain the deal. But without the lady, there would be no way we could deal with the inmate in the usual way. Do you know how the lady deals with your special cases? The warden scoffed. The particulars are none of my business. I trust that you will see to that. She takes them into the pond you're standing in front of and converts them into energy for her use. She has been powering the park and the events the town enjoys with your sacrifice. I do not have access to that power. Neither does Tobias. We have no need for sacrifices, so we have no need for a deal you struck with her. The warden shook his head, but I could already see the anger simmering there. So, you would break the deal that has brought so much good to your garden. The lady is sure to be cross with you when she returns. I shrugged. I doubt it. Either way, we can make a new deal when she gets back. We have no need for inmate details as well. There isn't much to upkeep without displays. The warden looked back at the statue, and he looked unsure of himself. Was this normal for demons? I didn't think I had ever seen them being indecisive, and it scared me a little. If these creatures were struggling so much, then what chance did I have? What if I could help you find your lady? He said suddenly. I felt a tingle up the back of my neck, but I laughed it off. Seems doubtful, I said, as I put my hooves in the lily pond. It's widely known that you rarely go farther than town. Are you planning a trip or something? He laughed. No, not me personally. I mean, I have something that can help you find her. It's a special item that I will absolutely want returned when you are done with it. It's a totem that would probably help a lot in the location of your lady. That got my interest. Oh, and all it will cost you is ending one problematic inmate for me. I looked out at the lily pond. That was quite an offer, and one I would be a fool not to take. I could kill someone. I'd done it before, but this would be crossing a different line. This was a line that Randy had never felt good about crossing, and the longer it went on, the more I understood why. It was abhorrent to kill like this, to do the dirty work of people who are disreputable. But if he really had something that could help us, then what choice did I have? You swear that whatever this item is, it will help us. The warden nodded, extending a hand to shake. I do. Trust me, Brandylow. The sooner the lady returns, the sooner we can get back to business as usual. I thought about it. Somehow I had found myself in a real Faustian bargain. This wasn't going to cost me anything. Not really. I didn't know this man. He was nothing to me. And this item could get me back the person I cared for the most. The person we all cared for most. That, too, was hypothetical, of course. Whether or not this thing would work was up to debate, but I felt like I owed it to her to try. Maybe I was trading my soul, but I didn't really care. I would have traded more to have her back. I shook his hand, trying not to shudder at the clamminess. Then it's a deal. You may bring your problem and your artifact tomorrow night,
and we will see that he bothers you no more." The warden smiled. "Excellent. I had all faith in you. I will set it up immediately, and we will make all preparations. Until tomorrow, then." I left him standing by the pond. He had found his way in. He could find his way back out again. In the meantime, I had work to do. Cutter was standing on the stage with the little doctor and the teacher from the green band class when they came in to get their food the next day. He was smiling and greeting them, and Dax raised a hand at him, which he returned. He turned back to see Masha scowling at him, but she wouldn't say why. "What do you reckon they're about?" Dunstan asked, as they sat down with their trays. "Nothing good," Gerald said, as he went on eating. "Probably just announcing midterms," Rebecca said, and when they all looked at her questioningly, she rolled her eyes. "It's not like it's a secret. Mrs. Lloyd has been talking about it for weeks now. We'll be taking our midterm soon, so they can tell us how we've improved." "Makes sense," Gerald said. "They need to test us, and the tests should reflect our aptitude. They'll probably have Dunstan identifying things, me following paths, Masha trying to break into people's minds, and Dex..." He stopped as if unsure what Dex and Ryan did, but the two of them shared a look. "Fighting," both of them said, before going back to their breakfast. "Really?" Rebecca said. "You think so?" Dex shrugged. "It makes sense. They haven't been teaching us all that fancy hand-to-hand and battle tactics with our powers, so we can run obstacle courses. Nah, it's gotta be pitched combat. That's the only thing that makes sense." The Red Bands had been hard at it for the last few weeks, and the development in the Red Band group was noticeable. Most of them had been bulky when they arrived, but all 5 of the Red Bands were covered in muscle now. They had all looked like football players, most of them, but now even Ryan, who had been the smallest, looked like a bodybuilder. They were on double portions, and their classes were always something that resembled gym, all day, every day. Ryan and Dex slept like the dead at night, and they woke up ravenous. "Good morning, students," Cutter said, and the general chatter quieted. "And welcome to the start of midterms." There were scattered applause, though most of them were probably too tired to realize what was being said. "This week, we will be assessing your skills and determining what you know and what you might still need to learn. If you are to be the best you can be for your country, then we need you in fighting form. So learn all you can and do your best to be your best." There were more applause, and as Cutter left the stage, Dex noticed Dunstan looking around expectantly. He'd been doing that for the last couple of days, like he was trying to find someone, and as he sat back and looked unappetizingly at his plate, he must have felt Dex looking at him. "What?" Dunstan said, putting a hand to his nose. "Do I have a booger?" "Nah, it's just, you seem like you're trying to find somebody, and you can't quite do it. I was just wondering if you'd found a girlfriend or something." Dunstan snorted. "Yeah, 'cause this place makes me feel real romantical." "No, it's, He stopped, moving in close as Jenny, Masha, and Britt put their heads together and talked quietly. "I saw a lady here the other day that I didn't recognize." "Yeah," Dex said. "I noticed there was an uptick in staff lately. I guess it's because of midterms." "Right, but I feel like I know her somehow. I've never met her, but she's familiar." Dex raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure I get it." Dunstan scrunched his face up, trying to find the words. It's like sometimes I know people without knowing them, you know?
Like I see them and I touch stuff and I feel like I know them because the people who had the items know them, but I don't actually know them. I don't know. I'm not making a lot of sense. No, I get it, Dex said. It's like you have someone else's memories and they aren't yours, so they don't feel quite right. Like a shirt that's too big or maybe too small. Exactly, Dunstan said, snapping his fingers. You get it. You boys keeping secrets over there? Rebecca said, Gerald smiling as he watched them in his quiet way. No more than usual, Dunstan said, leaning in as he told her about the lady that he had seen. Rebecca listened, and Dex thought that she might have her own familiar face here. He had seen the way that she looked at the little doctor, who sometimes stumped around here. Rebecca was a nice person, but Dex would have been afraid for her to look at him like that. That was a strangling look, if ever there was one. The weird part is, Gerald said, slurping the last of his eggs up, I feel like she might be my mom or something. I feel kind of fuzzy when I think about her, like I did for the girl at the group home. She was kind of like Wendy in the Peter Pan books. 5 parts caretaker and 2 parts mother and 3 parts unobtainable love. We all had a crush on her, but we also feared her rages too. This is sort of like that, but not quite, I guess. I'm guessing that's not how you feel about that little doctor guy, though, Dex said, and Rebecca looked like she had swallowed a lemon. The bell rang, and they all got up as they went to dump their trays. Dex hung close, waiting for her answer, and Dunstan wasn't far behind him. His curiosity had been piqued as well, and she finally sighed as she saw they weren't going to leave it alone. No, not at all. In fact, the feeling I get is pretty unfuzzy. Dr. Hammershoal is the reason that I'm here in the first place. He tricked me into revealing my dreams, something I thought was just part of my anxiety, and this place picked up my trail because of it. I hate him, and I get the feeling that he knows that. Dex wasn't so sure about that, but he kept it to himself. He was pretty sure that most of them had been on the radar of this place since birth, if not before. This place looked like the kind of government facility that might have slipped something extra into your mother's vitamins at the OBGYN so they could keep up with their little operation. This place had likely been operating since before the Cold War, maybe even since before Hitler started yelling about change in Germany, and they would be here long after the United States was dust. Government programs and cockroaches, those were the 2 things that survived the nukes. Not surprising, Dunstan said. He's always so polite when we have lessons together. I don't enjoy the things he makes me see, but he usually helps me forget them. Rebecca had been moving away, but she stopped and turned back. How does he make you forget? Dunstan scratched his head, a dreamy look coming over his face. I can't quite remember. It's some kind of rhyme or something. Once you reach 10, we may begin. Once you reach 9, you'll enter a relaxed state of mind, Rebecca said, shuddering a little despite her slack and easy posture. The 2 of them looked like they were out of it, and Dex shook them as their dreamy reactions took on a slow spiral. Both of them stuttered and looked around, not seeming sure where they were for a minute. Rebecca looked embarrassed. Dunstan just looked confused. And when she excused herself to go to class, Dex told Dunstan to keep an eye on her. She's likely to be in a bit of a state after that. Gotcha, Dunstan said, and after a fist bump, the 2 parted ways. Dex waved at Masha as she and her friends met Heather at the door to the Green Band Hall, and she waved back at him. She mouthed good luck at him as the 5 of them headed to class, and Dex looked around for Ryan as he went. The kid was usually close by, but when he saw him near the Red Band hallway, he let out a hiss of displeasure. He had clearly been waiting for Dex, and Dick and his little cadre had found him. As Dex approached,
he heard the bigger boy giving him the business. "Physical trials tomorrow, Runt. You think you're ready to take me on?" "Guess you'll just have to find out, won't you?" Ryan said, bristling at the boy who was about 1.5 heads taller than him. Dick laughed. "As if I'd squash you like a bug. You aren't even in my weight class, squirt. I guess it'd be a mercy, though. Might as well get you out of the running before you bring shame on the whole—" But he stopped talking when Dex put a hand on his shoulder. "But I am in your weight class, Dick. So why don't you save the shit talk for the mat?" Dick turned around, stepping out of Dex's grip before balling his fists up at his sides. "Why don't you let the runt fight his own battles, Dexter? If he deserves to be in the program, then he shouldn't have a problem towing it up with the big dogs." Dex rolled his eyes. "I'm tempted to let him do it, too, but I don't think Cutter would approve of finding you splattered all over the corridor." Dick sneered. "You think you're so funny, don't you, Dexter?" "Not especially," Dex said, "but I know if you keep pushing Ryan, he's going to show you that size ain't everything." Dick shook his head and stormed off, his posse following close behind him. Dexter wasn't sure how he would ever survive the dirty looks thrown his way by Dick's underlings, but he'd manage somehow. "You okay, Ryan?" he asked the younger boy. Ryan nodded. "Yeah. What took you so long?" "Got held up," Dex said. "You ready for midterms?" Ryan shrugged. "Can you be ready for midterms when you don't know what the class is?" Dex laughed. "True. I've never done school for very long, but I assume it's a little different from this." "Definitely," Ryan said as they walked into the gym. "Generally, the bullies who try to kill you in regular school don't have superpowers." They took their spots on the mat as Cutter walked in from the locker room in his usual PT gear. His warm smile was still in place. Dick was standing amidst his flunkies, grinning at the pair of them as they came over to join them. "All right, Red Bands," Cutter said as they huddled close. "I'm sure you're all terribly worried about midterms, but don't sweat it. It's going to be physical trials for the most part, capped off by one-on-one combat. This is not a pass-or-fail thing, so don't worry. We're testing how your powers have grown, nothing else. So don't be too nervous and just do your best. Now let's start with some calisthenics and move on to the obstacle course. Come on." "So," Miss Cashmere was saying, "for midterms, you will be working one-on-one with me. You will be given 3 prompts, and you will have to implant them in my mind. This will be timed, 10 minutes per person, but it will not be a pass or fail. We just want to see what you can do after some training. So let's pair off and work on image implanting for today. Daniel, you can work with me." Masha and Heather paired up, Jenny and Brittany already sitting next to each other, and took turns sending images to each other. This wasn't terribly hard, especially since no one had tried to infiltrate her mind during class since Chandra had her little accident. Masha had to be careful, though. She had given a few of the girls headaches when she had sent, and as she sent Heather a warm summer beach, she saw the girl shake her head and shiver a little. A trickle of blood slipped from her nose, and Masha realized that she had sent too much. "Easy, Masha," she said, wiping at her dribbling nose. "My brain will be coming out next." "Sorry," Masha said. "Sometimes I forget my own strength." Heather blew her nose and settled herself, and the two continued. "What happens when it does that?" Masha asked curiously. "What, when you send too much?" "Yeah," Masha said. She had never experienced it herself, but she was curious to know what it was like. So many of them sent like they were speaking through a string on a tin can, but Masha felt like she had a megaphone in her head most days. It's like when you wake up in the middle of the night and the signal on the TV has gone out, and all of a sudden you're just staring at all that static. You're half awake, so you don't know what's happening, but the static and the hissing noise just seem to envelop everything. It's like that,
Except in my head, I guess. Masha nodded, thinking about it as Heather pushed an image of a tranquil wood into her head. What she was describing was overload, Masha supposed, and it was like a blown circuit. Masha wondered if she could do more than just stun people like this, the way Dex did with his powers. Maybe, if she kept pushing that current, she could blow their circuits out, like she had done with Chandra. She hadn't really intended to do it, but she wasn't sorry that she had. Chandra had been trying to kill her after all, and it had been survival of the fittest. Masha hadn't wanted to die. "It's a tranquil forest," Masha said, and Heather nodded. "I'm not as good as you are, but I hope I'm getting better." Considering some of Heather's earlier images had looked like the graphics on her dad's N64, this one was outstanding. It was a little grainy, a little unreal, but it was fine. She had the general idea down, and that was what was important. At the end of the day, they just had to send, and then get better before the finals. Heather closed her eyes and started sending again. Masha picturing a scene from a western that her dad had liked. Masha got the image slowly. The mesas and gullies coming into view, then the sun and the clouds, and finally the scrub grass and the little trees. Masha could almost feel arid heat and sun beating down overhead, but it was all snatched away suddenly as someone fell off their chair. Masha opened her eyes and saw Brittany bending down to check on Jenny as she lay on the floor beside the table. She was thrashing a little, having a fit, as Masha's grandmother would have said, and as Brittany panicked, Mrs. Cashmere came over to help. "Nothing to worry about, children. As your powers become more powerful or your sending becomes more competent, this can happen. The brain is like a muscle. It must be worked out, or cramps and strains can occur." Mrs. Cashmere was holding her gently, stopping her from hurting herself as Jenny thrashed slightly. After a few minutes, Jenny shook herself and sat up. She told Miss Cashmere that she had a whopper of a headache, and the teacher got her some aspirin and told Brittany to let Jenny send for a bit before trying to send back. The class fell back into its usual back and forth, and Masha went back to her exercises with Heather. They had to be ready for midterms after all, and practice made perfect. It all started because my wife's cat just couldn't stay in the house. Marbles was not what you would call a smart cat. He was half wild, but my wife had found him when he was a kitten and cooed and petted some of the feral out of him. We'd found him about 3 months ago, a poor little bundle of fur that was shivering in the October wind, and despite his hisses and swipes, my wife had bundled him into her scarf and brought him home. We named him Marbles because his fur pattern reminded me of a marble. Also, he liked to zoom around the house in the early hours, and I usually said that he had lost his marbles pretty irregularly. The cat has also made it pretty clear that in the matters of most things, I am his backup human. He still hisses and swats me more often than not, and sometimes while I'm giving him pets, I get the stink eye if I try to cuddle up with my girlfriend while he's anywhere near her. The only time he seems to be happy to see me is when his food bowl is empty, and only then until it's full again. Despite his on-again, off-again hatred of me, he generally seems to like being inside, though he still makes occasional trips out, which is how our story begins. When I opened the door to take the garbage out before bed last night, Marbles decided to run out into the 20-degree weather outside the house and disappear into the winter wonderland beyond. This led to a 4-hour session of Sam standing in the snow and calling for Marbles as she waved a bag of treats around like a cheerleader doing a routine. I humored her until I looked down and realized that it was 2 a.m, and she'd been standing in her flip-flops and sweatpants long enough that her skin was starting to turn blue and her teeth were chattering.
Marbles hadn't even put in an appearance, and as I herded her inside, she made it pretty clear that she didn't want to leave him outside all alone. Sweetie, he came from outside. He's been back since. He probably has a hot date or something and knows of a nice, snug place to stay warm. Give him a night to shiver in the cold and he'll come back. She didn't like it, but she went to bed, and I held her until she finally fell asleep. The alarm started barking at 7:30 the next morning, but luckily, I had the day off. My intentions were to sit around in my bathrobe and play video games until it was time to make dinner. But as I sat on the couch, Sam gave me that look that let me know that I would ignore her request at my peril. Before you get into your game, I want you to go look for marbles. I sighed, and it must have been pretty deep because her eyes gained a few shades of anger. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something better to do? Babe, you know he won't come to me. Marbles hates me. I might have an easier time calling you up a feral cat from the woods than him. No, she said, her voice already sounding watery. I don't want another cat. I want marbles. At least go try. He's probably sitting somewhere cold and hungry and waiting to come in. It's 18 degrees outside, and I can't stand the thought of him out there all alone. Please, for me? I sighed again. She knew I couldn't say no when she asked like that. So, as Sam went off to her shift at Walmart, I bundled up in my thickest coat and my heaviest snow boots and went out to look for marbles. I was trailing smoke from my first cigarette of the day as I called out for marbles and looked for footprints. The snow on the ground was old. It had snowed Monday, and today was Wednesday, and there were plenty of tracks in it. It had been a while since I had claimed to be anything close to a Boy Scout, but I recognized deer tracks and raccoon tracks as well. I also saw what I thought were cat tracks, and sighed again as I noticed them heading off into the woods. Great. A winter hike was just what I wanted to do today. Marbles, I called, hoping he would come out and I could go back in. No such luck, and I left a little pile of treats in the snow to hopefully coax him back as I looked. I clumped off into the woods. The snow, only a few inches worth of frozen crust by this point. It was still in the trees, however, which I discovered as it fell on my head and soaked me through to my undershirt. I shivered, shaking it off as I followed what I hoped were cat tracks through the winter wonderland. The snows had been bad this year, but this was the longest I could remember them hanging in there. It would be a hell of a flood when it finally melted, though I suppose that would be a problem for the little places further downstream. As I walked, I kept looking around like I expected to see something big and angry following me. It was a feeling, something on the back of my neck, but when I glanced in the direction that my neck hairs were going, I didn't see anything. It was just snow and scraggy trees as far as the eye could see. I didn't like it. This was South Carolina after all, and the thought of being stalked by a half-starved bear or a cougar or something was extremely off-putting. I was still following the tracks, getting ready to give up, when I saw the little bastard. He was just standing there. The swirl on his side was kind of hard to make out, but it was definitely him. "Marbles!" I yelled, trying to inject some enthusiasm in my voice as I said it. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." Instead, he just turned and went deeper into the woods. "You little asshole!" I yelled, crunching through the snow as I followed him. "Get back here!" I trailed him through the woods, and it almost seemed like he was leading me somewhere. Marbles would stop sometimes and look back at me, making sure I was following him before taking off again. It was really beginning to grind at me as I went, and I was considering just heading home and letting him freeze. That was when I saw something rising up out of the trees. I thought it might be a shed at first, but the closer I got, the more I realized it was a house. I came out of the trees and into a clearing that held a huge, dilapidated, 2-story house. The roof had fallen in on it, making the second story look like a sagging cake topper, and the windows on both floors were either broken or cracked all to hell. It was black, like tar black, and the porch was long and sweeping as it tried to hold the roof up on the groaning thing. The top was covered in snow, the stuff just falling in now as it sat empty, and I wondered how I had never seen this thing before. I was no hiker, but Sam and I came out here regularly for walks. How deep in the woods was I? Could I find my way back out before I froze? These questions and more scrolled through my head as I approached the house tentatively. If ever there was a haunted house, it would be this place. I imagined I could see faces behind the fractured glass, though I was pretty sure it was just the snow glare, and the whole structure seemed to invite me closer. It felt like I was supposed to go inside, like I was meant to see this sagging hulk, but as I came to the porch, I heard a pitiful meow and the crunch of snow. I turned, and there he was. Marbles was standing next to a busted-out basement window, and I winced as he jumped inside. There was no way I was going in there, but as I heard the pitiful meow again, I knew that I would have to. Sam would never forgive me if I left her cat in this sagging monstrosity, and as I got down on my hands and knees, it was hard to miss the red stains in the snow. Something had come through here recently, and it had been injured. The window wasn't just broken either. It was busted inward, and I could see the glass on the floor of the subterranean space. It was dark in there. The other windows seemed covered in snow, but I thought I could just make out something moving in there. "Marbles!" I called, hoping he would come out. I heard a meow, but it wasn't from the basement. "Marbles!" I said, seeing a head come to the edge of that darkness. That was Marbles, but as the meow sounded again, I realized it was behind me. I turned my head, and there he was. Marbles looked bad. He was hunkered on the porch, shaking and shivering, and it looked like one of his back legs was injured. He was watching me with real fear, like he was trying to tell me not to go down there. And as I got up, I started walking towards him. I could hear a sound like a panther from the depths of the basement. That wasn't Marbles down there, and whatever it was big. I grabbed up the cat and tucked him in my coat before I took off running. He shivered against me. Poor little guy was half frozen, and I found my tracks as I ran along, trying to get back to the house. Behind me, I heard something come tearing out of the basement and just start running after us. I tried to look behind me to see what it was, but it was kicking up too much snow for me to see. It looked like a huge cat, but that was a good guess, and as good a one as I could make. I cut left and cheered internally as it hit it and came up short. I just couldn't see what it was. The sudden flurry of snow made it hard to see much of anything, but I could see a familiar rock poking from the snow. The rock was a spot we usually looked for on our walks, and it meant we were about a quarter mile from the house. My lungs were burning, and Marbles had sunk his claws into my shirt deep enough that I could feel them through my undershirt. Whatever had been after us had stopped chasing us. At least, I didn't see it anymore. But as I slowed down a little to catch my breath, I could sense that feeling of being watched again. Marbles was still spooked, his claws hanging on, and his wet hackles were up. But the closer we got to the house, the more I thought that it might be over. When I heard the snow cracking about 5 minutes later and saw the huge whatever it was rising up out of the crusty ice, I knew I had been wrong. It was covered in snow, and I thought that it might be some kind of bear. It was as big as a grizzly, but it looked long like a cougar or a mountain lion. It loosed a roar like a lion before it jumped at me, and I did the only thing I could do before it hit me and mauled me to death. I went flat, Marbles yowling as I crunched into the snow, and as it passed over me, I jumped up and started running. I was running without any real destination, just trying to get home before this whatever it was got me, and I could put a door between it and me. When the road came into view, I realized I had overshot. I liked my chances of running on the paved road better than I did of running through the snow, though, and as I came to the blacktop, I didn't slow in the least bit. There was another loud noise behind me as I ran, and I turned to see the creature standing on the edge of the road and looking at me with hateful eyes. Seeing it there, I couldn't help but think it was some rogue snow animal, its features a perfect mixture of bear and cat. The eyes, like dirt clods, narrowed as they slid back into the snowy forest, and my shiver had nothing to do with the weather, as it fell back into the hard-packed snow and was gone. Marbles calmed down a little then, still shivering against me as we went home. My girlfriend found us on the couch a bit later, both bundled up as I sipped hot cocoa and finished writing this up. I don't know what I saw, but I know I won't be going into the snow ever again. If it really is made of the stuff, then it'd have a harder time getting me once it's melted. I also have no intention of going anywhere near that house again. Whatever lives there is wrong on a fundamental level, and I shudder to think of what could have been waiting for me in that basement. One thing has come of it, I suppose. Marbles has decided that I must be a pretty alright guy, and he didn't leave my lap until Sam came in and scooped him up so she could coo over him. I had bandaged his back leg, but it looked like something tried to take a bite out of him. If the jagged teeth, probably old pine cones by the look of them, are any indication, I would say that Marbles and I both got off very lucky. They walked into confinement, the three of them casting long shadows as they walked through the front door and into the confinement unit of Stragview. The on-duty sergeant looked up from what he was doing long enough to buzz them in, and then found something better to do, so he wouldn't have to answer any questions if called to do so. He knew what the paperwork said. It said that James Allen Butterfield was being sent to the death house for housing as of tonight. He also knew, like most of the staff, that the death house had been closed, and, like most of the staff, that Mr. Butterfield would never ride the lightning or take God's sleepy needle in a few weeks. He was going to disappear, this very night in fact, and it couldn't have been soon enough. Some of the guards may have mixed feelings about the execution methods of some of the death row inmates, but Butterfield wasn't one of them. Most of the inmates would have seen nothing wrong with it either. James Butterfield was universally hated, and with good reason. Not only was he a murderer, but he was a murderer of children, and no one wanted to consort with him. His list of crimes was long and colorful, but they mattered a little in the end. At the end of the day, inmate Butterfield was a nuisance who drew too much attention onto the day-to-day operation of any dorm he was in. He seemed incapable of just acting like a regular person. Some of the inmates had speculated that perhaps his parents had beaten him as a child. Others said, if they had, it clearly wasn't enough. However much it had been, it wasn't the right amount, and Butterfield was the worse for it. Would that his mother had drowned him in the bathtub, or his father had racked him over a little too hard one night after coming home from the bar. 8 children would still be alive. 2 women wouldn't be spending time in Laurelwood, and everyone would be better for his absence. Instead, they now had to conduct tonight's business with the clandestine planning and execution of a group of witches at full moon. Butterfield was waiting at the glass, smiling his terrible snaggletooth grin at them. His teeth leaned like boards on a derelict fence, and many of them were the off-white of old gravestones. His oral hygiene, though, was far from the worst part of him. It was his lamb strangler's eyes, the color of heartless ice in the Arctic blue, that made people want nothing to do with him. Some of the guards had whispered that he reminded them of a certain inmate that was no longer hell-raising in these parts. One inmate Slayton. But inmate Slayton had been a small annoyance next to Butterfield. Butterfield was different than your average troublemaker. Butterfield liked to hurt people, and he was big enough to do it with relative ease.
Oh my, to what do I owe a visit from the illustrious Warden of Stragview?
Butterfield said in his soft, pissy voice. You're being transferred to the death house, inmate Butterfield. Effective immediately, you will be remanded to J-Dorm until your execution. Butterfield scratched his chin thoughtfully.
That's funny, Warden. I only recall having received one of my mandatory appeals. I am allotted 3. Isn't that right?
The warden sneered. I'm afraid Mr. Conley has declined to return or to represent you. It probably has something to do with you trying to bite his face the last time he was here. Butterfield only shrugged.
I didn't try. I did bite his face. 12 stitches, I hear. 2 more than Alvarez.
The warden pulled air in through his nose and tried his best not to turn this man into ash. Alvarez had been a new guard, one of those kinder, gentler officers the academy kept promising, and he had been certified for less than 6 months. He'd been handing out mail in Pod 2 of F-Dorm when Butterfield had come up on his left side and bit his cheek. It had been sudden and needless, and Alvarez had been sent to Kashmir Medical for 10 stitches because of it. Worse still, Alvarez had quit over it. He just couldn't go back in there, he said, Butterfield or no Butterfield. The warden had told him to take some time and decide if he thought he could come back, but he didn't think Alvarez would come back. Inmate Butterfield, you are being rehoused. Submit to hand restraints and prepare to be moved. Butterfield smiled at the 2 bruisers beside him.
And if I do not?
Officer Cone smiled, and Sergeant Mays cracked his knuckles. Then these 2 gentlemen go into your cell, and I apply a healthy dose of chemical agents. You will likely be beaten in the struggle, perhaps even badly. Then you can sit in J-Dorm with broken ribs or a fractured skull while you wait for your execution date. A man could sit in J-Dorm for months like that before it's time for him to go. And medical isn't exactly in a big hurry to come see you after what you did to Nurse Hudges. What a fuck-up that had been. Butterfield had been in confinement for 3 months at that point, when his medical call-out had been answered. He had been as fine as paint for day shift the whole time. So, Officer Carlsberg thought it would be okay to step into the office and take a call while Butterfield was being seen by the nurse. When the traffic came over in choppy bursts that she needed assistance, he found her beaten to a pulp as Butterfield prepared to create his latest victim. They had gassed him, 5 of them had put him in restraints, and now he didn't leave confinement without an escort of at least 1 higher-up and 3 officers. Carlsberg had been suspended for 2 weeks without pay, but they couldn't afford to fire him. Officers were far too dear to fire for much these days. Butterfield didn't look terribly put off by this.
I suppose I could use a change of scenery. Confinement is so drab, after all.
He turned his back to the flap, and as it came down, he poked his hands through to receive the cuffs. Sergeant Mays took a step forward, but the warden put out a hand and took his cuffs. "Sir," Sergeant Mays said, but he stopped when he saw the warden's eyes. The first cuff slipped on just as Butterfield tried to pull his arm back in, but the warden had a firm grip on the middle chain. "Not today, boy," the warden growled. Butterfield pulled with all his might, but he was tugging against an immovable object. The warden brought his hand out and did something with the wrist that made the big man cry out in pain. He tried to pull away again, but the warden had him now, and he had no intention of letting him go. "Give me your other hand, inmate Butterfield." "Suck my..." But he squealed again as the warden put pressure on the wrist. "Give me your hand, James, or I won't just squeeze it like your daddy used to." He felt the man stiffen. "How do you know about that?" "I know a lot of things, James. I know how he used to hurt you, how he used to look for reasons to hurt you. And if he'd known you better, he would have known you deserved it. You may not have then. You were a child. But you deserve everything you get now. Everything and more. I don't have to make you hurt, however. You could come along with no trouble at all. Or you could come along with a broken wrist. The choice is yours. But I suggest you make it quickly." The other hand came out, as if on cue, and the warden snapped the cuffs on. "Sergeant, roll door 8 in quad 2, the warden said into his radio. He stepped aside as Mays and Combs stepped up around him. They wanted their fun too, and the warden couldn't blame them. Alvarez had been their friend, and they wanted to give this waste of life a little payback. He spun around and made to lunge at them, but the 2 were strong, chosen for this because of their size and strength. Mays pushed him backward, and Butterfield fell on his ass. He was forced to look up at the 2 of them, but wasn't quick enough to do more than yell something stupid before Cone stepped forward and booted him in the face. "On the ground, legs apart," he shouted as he brought out the leg restraints. "Shove it up your..." Butterfield started, but Mays kicked him in the ribs when he refused to turn. He curled up as he tried to protect his vitals, and they rolled him onto his stomach as they got to work. Pretty soon, the leg shackles were on, and they were lifting him between them as they hauled him off. "Didn't have to be like this," the warden said, as they headed for the door to the quad. Butterfield said nothing. He continued to say nothing as they put the spit shield on him and put the orange mittens on his hands, the ones with the Velcro straps. He was nicely trussed when they finally carried him through the middle gate. The warden could see him peeking as they steered him away from the front and towards the west gate. West gate was where people went when they were being transported somewhere, and the warden knew that Butterfield likely wanted to know where they were going. He wouldn't believe me if I told him, the warden thought, as they tossed him into the back of a transport van and slammed the door. "Let's go," the warden said, as Cones climbed into the driver's seat and he took the passenger. "We've wasted enough time." Mays climbed into the space between the cage and the front, and as Butterfield lay there groaning, the three men drove him to his final destination. The back door came open and found Butterfield staring out at the last place he would have expected. The gates of the botanical gardens were thrown wide, and the lights led down the path and into the dark depths of the garden. Butterfield wasn't sure he wanted to follow those lights. They were just a little too inviting, and he thought about making a break for the town he knew was just off to the side of the woods that were out of sight. Before he could decide, however, the van accelerated forward and sent him spilling from the back as he bounced across the concrete. He rolled through the gates, groaning as he tumbled, the restraints digging into his wrists and legs as the pavement chewed at his exposed skin. He lay before the ticket booth, panting as he tried to get to his feet. The gates, however, were already closing as he got to a knee, and the crash was exceptionally ominous as they came together. Butterfield got to his feet, looking through the murky netting of the spit shield as he tried to make heads or tails of the place. The pathway wound through a skeletal collection of trees and into what appeared to be an exhibit of mushrooms. The lights clearly intended for him to follow them, but Butterfield turned left instead, looking at the outskirts of a desolate farmland that looked ready for the next year's planting when spring came. Butterfield rarely did what people expected of him, and this would be no exception, he thought. He was so taken by the choices ahead of him that he failed to notice when the chains tumbled from him and the orange gloves simply fell from his hands. He had taken only a couple of steps towards the farmland when he saw them. They awakened something in him, something he hadn't thought about in years. As bright as the path was, the farm area was as shadowy as a crypt at midnight, and by the light of the crescent moon, he could see the hairy, goaty things as they roamed around and waited for him to step into the darkness. He could hear the voice of his old grandmother, a woman who was far more sadistic than his father had ever been. She didn't hit, she didn't yell, but she was a master of verbal trauma. Every bad behavior, every slip-up, every sin was met with a story of what would happen to him if he continued. She had died when he was 10, but the stories she had told him would live on forever. One Christmas, as little James went about his mischief, she had told him about how the naughty list was the least of his concerns. "Father Christmas will see you if you continue to do such things, James." "I ain't worried about no Santa Claus," James told her, his accent as far from hers as bread was to mud. "It isn't him you should fear, my boy. He will give your name to the Krampus, and he and his Belsnickles
will come to take you away." Little James had looked up with concern, asking what that was, and Grandma had been happy to instruct him. "The Krampus comes with his wicker basket and his birch rod, his bell sinicles capering around him. They are goaty, with horns and hooves and coarse fur, and the children hear them clump, clump, clumping up the hall, and know that their doom approaches. They put the children in a wicker cage, beat them with the rods, and drag them to hell, so they may torment them for all eternity. If you keep moving down the path you are on, your fate will be the same, boy." As he watched those hunkered and hoofed shadows moving through the darkness, he remembered the fate his grandmother had spoken of, and shivered. Buttersworth hadn't known fear in a very long time, and as he turned and ran down the lighted path, it never occurred to him that this might be part of the trap as well. He flew down the path, the exhibits rushing past like the spindly arms of the dead trees. He didn't know where he was going, but as the lily pond rose up before him, he found his eyes rising to the statue of the lady that stood on the plinth within it. She was an island in this small pond, and as he moved close to the shore, he barely noticed that he was free. There was something intoxicating about her. She was his mother, his ideal mother, and his wife all in one. She was love and hope and the realization of what he had never had or felt before. She seemed to spread her arms wide, inviting him in as he sloshed into the water, and he would have probably drowned himself if the statue had asked it of him. Unfortunately, they never got the chance to find out. The clop on the pavement was loud enough to bring him out of his stupor, and then they were all around him. The bell snickles, their clubs drawn and ready to dispense his punishment and drag him off to hell. Butterfield made a sloppy dash, but they were on him in a second. They were pounding him with those clubs, smashing his face and breaking his bones. Butterfield tried to fight, tried to push them back, but their furry bodies were as strong as oaks. He coughed and was shocked to see blood on his hands. One of them caught him behind the knee, and he fell hard into the water. A hoof came down and pushed his head beneath the surface, and as he tried to struggle, James Butterfield gasped and pulled the muddy water of the pond into his lungs. He was drowning. He was dying, and as the darkness came up to collect him, he feared he might find a very different kind of hell was waiting for him. Whatever it was, the Brandy-Low never discovered. Butterfield sank into the lily pond, just like the others had, and whether his essence was added to the collective or not was open to speculation. James Butterfield was dead, and that was all that mattered to those involved. "It's done," Sam said, bringing the cuffs to the warden as he stood by the gate. "Thank you, my friend," the warden said, bowing a little. "I know your qualms about the operation, but—" "We aren't friends," Sam said, "so fulfill your end of the bargain." The warden sighed and reached into his pocket, pulling out a stone with a screaming face on it. "I will have this returned to me
when your lady is returned. Am I understood?" "Perfectly," Sam said, as he looked at the face as the two of them took their leave. How this was going to help, Sam didn't know, but he could feel the power coursing through it, and he was hopeful that it might be just what they needed. He stumbled back to the guard shack and found that someone had brought the mail in. There, amongst the bills and the garbage, was a letter from Randy. It was from an address in Arkansas, and as he slid it open, he hoped for good news. It wasn't there, but it was hopeful. "Sam, have not found the lady, but I have found other brandylow. Some are old, the ones from the park, but some of them are the lost ones that Tobias have talked about. They joined me, said they felt moved to find me, and now we don't worry about the Whistler anymore. He avoids us now, and I think we're getting close to her. Hope all is well. Randy." Time, it seemed, was fleeting, and Sam had to get this to Randy quick. Sam called to Marshall, one of the few reliable ones, and told him to make ready to leave. "You need to take this to Randy. It should be easy to find him if you feel him out. Take this letter and go to the place he sent it, and..." But Sam could already see the futility. Marshall had been turned around the time of the Civil War. He didn't understand. He didn't understand the world any more than Sam would have understood his. This was too important to leave in the hands of fate. Sam knew what needed to be done, but Randy wasn't going to like it when he did. He told Marshall to return to his work, and he went to talk to Tobias.